The winter air hung heavy over the trenches, and the men could feel it in their bones, each breath carrying the taste of smoke and wet earth. The First World War had already torn the land apart into a nightmare of mud wire and broken trees, and the space between the opposing trenches was called no man's land. For the soldiers who lived day after day with their heads bowed under the whistle of shells and the sudden crack of rifles, that stretch of earth felt like the edge of another world. There were stories told in hushed voices when the guns fell quiet. Stories that had nothing to do with the enemy, and everything to do with what lurked in the dark. The men were young and old farm boys from the Midwest, coal miners from Pennsylvania factory, workers from New York City streets. They had been thrown into France with rifles and uniforms and the order to hold the line against an enemy they rarely saw at close range. What they saw more often was the desolation before them, a land torn into black craters and water-filled pits. The ground was always wet, a sucking mud that swallowed boots and sometimes whole bodies. When the night came, the silence was worse than the sound of battle. A man could stand, listening to the soft drip of water and the distant creak of shattered trees, and believe that something was moving out there. At first, the soldiers dismissed it. Rats, they said. The trenches were full of them. Large, fat creatures that fed on scraps and sometimes on the fallen. When a man swore he had seen a figure darting in the fog, his comrades told him he was jumpy from lack of sleep. But the tales grew. Stranger ones claimed that shapes stood just beyond the wire at dusk, staring without making a sound. Some swore the shapes were men in rags, deserters who had lost their minds. Others whispered that they were not men at all. The nights stretched on and the fear gnawed quietly. The human mind in war clings to any story to explain the unexplainable. When shells fell short and the earth shook like thunder, men cursed their luck. When nothing happened and the dark pressed in on all sides, they cursed something else entirely. There were rumors carried from unit to unit about patrols sent into no man's land, never returning, or coming back broken and silent, with eyes that seemed to look past the living. Private William Carter was one of the many who heard such tales. He was 19, from Ohio, and had never left home until the war brought him to France. His letters home tried to sound cheerful, but in the dim light of the dugout, he confessed to his closest friend that he sometimes heard footsteps above the trench line when no patrol was out. He swore that when he lifted his head just enough to look, he caught sight of a figure running low to the ground faster than any man had the right to move. His friend laughed nervously and told him to keep it to himself. Some things were better left unsaid. By day, the war kept their minds busy. Artillery thundered across. The fields and smoke choked the sky. By night, the land lay still and the strange feeling returned. Even the officers did not like to patrol too deep into the mud at night. The men learned to fear the silence more than the gunfire. Silence meant listening, and listening too long meant hearing what should not be heard, breathing that did not belong to them, scratching that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was during one of these long nights that the first real scare came. A patrol of 3 men slipped over the top under a moonless sky. Their task was simple: to check the wire and listen for German movement. Hours passed with no word. Then, just before dawn, a single man stumbled back into the trench. His face was pale and his uniform torn. He spoke little, only muttering that something had been moving out there with them, not ahead, not behind, but alongside. When pressed, he only shook his head and would not speak further. The other 2 men never returned. After that, the whispers turned into fearful belief. The wild men, some called them beings that lived in the broken land, feeding on the dead and moving through the craters like hunters. Some said they were deserters who had gone mad. Others swore they were older creatures that had always lived in the forests, now exposed by war. Whatever they were, the soldiers began to feel watched. The officers discouraged such talk. They needed discipline, not ghost stories, but the human heart cannot be ordered. And every man who closed his eyes at night felt the same uneasy weight. No man's land was not only a battlefield. It was something deeper, a place where men vanished without trace, and where the line between human and beast grew thin. As the days turned colder and rations thinned, The soldiers braced themselves not only for the enemy but for the waiting silence. Every glance into the fog seemed to reveal movement. Every breath carried the weight of unseen eyes. Carter and others like him wrote in their journals, though they rarely explained what troubled them in plain words. They knew their families would never understand what it meant to stand between two armies in a world where monsters might be real. The chapter of fear had only begun. The wild men were no longer whispers. They were shadows moving just beyond reach, and soon the soldiers of the trenches would realize that their war was not only against flesh and blood enemies, but against something far stranger, waiting in the endless mud and silence. The fog rolled in thick across no man's land, and the men watched it gather with dread. The mist was heavy, pale gray and clinging. It swallowed the barbed wire posts and crater edges until the ground itself seemed to vanish in a sea of shifting shapes. To most it was just another night in France, but to those who had heard the whispers it was something worse. The fog gave cover to the enemy, but it also gave cover to whatever else stalked the land private. Carter sat against the damp trench wall, clutching his rifle. His hands were steady enough during the day, but now in the silence of night, he noticed the tremor in his fingers. His friend Corporal Mason leaned close, speaking in a hushed tone. Mason was older, 26, from Kentucky, and had seen more of life than Carter. He had no patience for ghost stories, yet even he admitted that the night carried a weight heavier than the war itself. He reminded Carter to keep his head down and eyes forward, and not to give the fog more life than it already had. That night, another patrol was ordered. 5 men climbed the ladder and slipped into the mist. Carter and Mason were not part of it, but they listened as the patrol disappeared beyond sight. The minutes dragged into hours. No one spoke in the trench. All they could hear was the faint squelch of mud and the distant rumble of artillery far away. Then the sound changed. It was not the enemy and not the familiar. It was a low cry drifting back from the fog, thin like a wounded animal, then cut short as if smothered. The men froze, every head turned to the mist, waiting for the patrol to return. When one figure finally emerged, stumbling into the trench line, the others rushed to meet him. His face was white as chalk and his helmet gone. His uniform was torn across the chest with marks no one could explain. The man was Corporal Ellis. He gasped for breath, unable to form words. His hands shook violently. He finally managed to say that they had seen movement in the craters. Not one figure, but several. They had thought them to be Germans, until the shapes stood taller and moved with a swiftness no human carried. The trench went silent. Officers tried to press him for details, but Ellis broke into a fit of trembling, shouted that the others had been taken, not killed, taken away into the mist. His voice cracked as he swore he would not go out again. Not for any order, not for any war. They dragged him to the aid post, but the damage was done. The soldiers had heard, and once a story rooted itself in their minds, it grew. Over the next days, strange signs appeared in no man's land. Men on lookout swore they saw figures crawling across the craters, not toward the lines, but circling them as if studying the trenches. Some mornings the wire was found bent or cut, yet no attack followed. At night, faint calls echoed across the mud. Not in German, not in English, but something guttural and raw. The sound sent shivers through even the bravest. Carter could not shake the feeling of being watched. He told Mason one night that he dreamed of faces pale and ragged staring at him from the dark. Mason told him to keep such thoughts to himself or risk losing his mind like Ellis. But Mason too began to grow restless. He admitted that he heard scratching near the trench wall when the fog thickened, and that once when he peered over, he saw what looked like a man crouched low in the mud, staring back before slipping away faster than sight could follow. One evening, a new unit rotated into their sector. Fresh men from America, full of laughter and jokes. They laughed at the old stories, dismissing them as trench madness. The veterans said nothing. They knew better. Within 2 nights, the laughter stopped when one of the newcomers vanished during latrine duty. The rest no longer joked. They stood their watches with wide eyes, rifles clutched tight and silence on their lips. By now the name Wild Men had taken hold. It was whispered with both fear and reluctant fascination. Some said they were deserters who had abandoned the war and lived off the dead. Others swore they were something older, creatures of the woods driven into the open by shells. Still others muttered they were men twisted by the war itself, grown feral and hungry in the ruins. Whatever the truth, their presence was undeniable. More and more patrols failed to return. More cries echoed in the night. The line between soldier and prey blurred. The officers tried to stamp out the rumors, but they too grew pale when faced with missing men. They blamed Germans, they blamed nerves. They never spoke of monsters, but the men in the mud knew better. The war was terrible, but it was a human terror, predictable in its own brutal rhythm. The wild men were different. They moved where they wished. They took who they wished. And worst of all, they left behind no trace but fear. Carter began to write more in his journal, though his words faltered. He described the eyes he thought he saw in the fog, glimmering faintly as if catching light where no light was. His writing carried more questions than answers. Were they men? Were they beasts? Or were they some reflection of the soldiers' own breaking minds? The more he wrote, the more real the question became. He hid the pages, fearing discovery, but the act of writing kept him steady. The days rolled on, and with them the sense of siege grew. No man's land no longer felt like empty ground. It felt occupied. The soldiers had not yet seen the full shape of what lived there, but the shadows pressed closer. The wild men were patient. They were waiting. And soon the soldiers would learn that the monsters of the fog were not content with whispers and stolen patrols. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the trench walls sagged with the weight of water. The men shoveled endlessly to keep the floor from collapsing, but the mud always won. Carter felt the cold soak through his boots into his bones. Each night, he lay down in the dugout half awake, half dreaming his rifle within reach. The war itself felt distant during those hours. The shells were fewer now, the gunfire sporadic. It was the silence that gnawed at them. The silence broken only by faint sounds, drifting from the wasteland ahead. On the 4th night, an order came down. A small reconnaissance party would cross into no man's land and confirm whether the enemy was preparing an assault. The men groaned under the order. They knew what the officers would not admit. The Germans were not the only danger waiting out there. Carter, Mason, and 3 others were chosen. They strapped on their gear and climbed the ladder into the night fog. The world outside the trench felt unreal. The fog was dense and heavy, the ground sucking at their boots with every step. The twisted shapes of blasted trees stood like skeletons against the sky. The party moved slowly in a line, rifles ready, eyes scanning the gloom. Carter's heart pounded louder than his footsteps. He forced himself to breathe evenly. Each step felt like walking deeper into a place where men did not belong. They moved past the first line of wire, then the second. Their task was simple, but none of them thought of the Germans now. They thought of the stories of Ellis and his missing patrol, of eyes watching from the dark. The further they went, the stronger the feeling grew. Carter swore he heard movement to their left, a rustle in the mud like something crawling. Mason held up a hand and the group froze. Silence pressed down on them. Then came a sound, soft and deliberate. Breathing not theirs, but close. Out of the fog, a shape emerged low to the ground and quick. It darted across the crater lip and vanished before anyone could raise a rifle. Another shape followed, then another. The men spun in every direction, rifles trembling. The shapes were not Germans. Their movements were wrong, too fast, too fluid. They circled the party, keeping low, as if hurting them. Carter caught a glimpse. In the moonlight, a face gaunt and pale. The skin stretched tight over sharp bones, hair long and filthy, eyes reflecting faint light like an animal's. It was gone in a blink, but the image seared into his mind. The men broke their silence. One fired into the fog, the shot echoing across the field. Mason cursed and ordered them to hold fire, but panic had already taken root. Shapes closed in from every side. The soldiers shouted, stumbling backward, trying to keep together. Carter felt the air shift beside him and turned just in time to see a figure rush at him from the dark. It moved on all fours, then rose upright in a sudden lunge. Its arms were long, its fingers claw-like. He squeezed the trigger. The shot lit the fog for a second. The figure fell, shrieking a sound more beast than man. The others surged forward in response. Dark forms rushed the group from the mist, snarling low, guttural sounds. The patrol fired wildly. Mason shouted to keep formation, but the line broke. A man to Carter's right screamed as he was dragged down into the mud by two figures. Their pale arms pulled him away into the crater. His cries choked off as if smothered. The patrol turned to help, but more shapes appeared blocking the way. Carter and Mason fired again, and again their rifles flashing in the dark. The creatures flinched, but did not fall easily. They moved with unnatural speed. Panic won out. The soldiers stumbled back toward their trench, firing blindly. The fog swirled with shadows rushing around them. Carter tripped in the mud. Mason yanked him up and shoved him forward. Behind them, the screams of another man cut through the night, then only silence. The survivors did not look back. They ran until the wire loomed ahead and the trench line appeared. The sentries hauled them over and down into safety. Their faces were white, their uniforms soaked in mud and blood. Only 3 returned, Carter Mason and one other, Private Jenkins. They collapsed against the trench wall, gasping for breath. Their eyes were wide, unblinking. The officers demanded answers, but the men said little. Carter managed to whisper that they had been hunted, not by Germans, not by deserters, but by something else. Mason said nothing at all. He only sat with his rifle, still clutched in his hands, his knuckles pale with strain. Jenkins wept quietly, refusing to raise his head. Word spread quickly. The wild men were no longer shadows in the fog. They were real, and they had struck. The men who heard the story looked out across no man's land with new fear. They no longer wondered if the creatures existed. They wondered when they would come again. That night the trench was quiet. No one laughed. No one spoke above a whisper. The sound of rain on the duckboard seemed louder than cannon fire. Carter lay awake, his mind replaying the face he had seen. Pale, hollow eyes, and a scream that still rang in his ears. He tried to convince himself it was a man driven mad by war, but deep inside he knew the truth. Whatever. They were not simply men. The war had opened something on that ground, something wild and merciless, and this was only the beginning. The trench smelled of damp earth and fear. The men spoke less now. Each face was drawn, eyes hollow with sleepless nights. They had seen war before, but what happened in the fog was something different. It did not leave behind the usual wreckage of shell and shrapnel. It left questions. Questions. No officer dared to answer. Carter sat hunched over his journal, scratching lines with a dull pencil. His words were broken, scattered. He wrote about the eyes he had seen, the way they glimmered unnaturally. In the dark, he wrote about the sound of the scream that rose and then cut off like a knife. He did not write the word monster. He was afraid if he did, the word would take shape and live on the page. Mason noticed his writing and told him to be careful. Such words could bring punishment if an officer read them. Better to keep quiet, Mason said. Better to act like nothing had happened. The officers did exactly that. They called the loss of 2 men on patrol an unfortunate accident, blaming German raiders. They held a short address telling the company that nerves and exhaustion were dangerous enemies. They ordered discipline. They ordered silence. Yet when the officers turned away, the men whispered among themselves. No one believed the official story. They had heard the screams themselves. They had seen the torn uniform of Jenkins, who had nearly been pulled into the crater before Carter's rifle shot drove the things back. Jenkins himself had not recovered. He shook constantly, his hands jerking at sudden noises. He muttered to himself at night, refusing to close his eyes for fear of what waited in dreams. The medic gave him powders, but they did little. He clung to his rifle even when ordered to rest. Eventually, the officers pulled him from the line, sending him to the rear. They said he was broken by shell shock, but Carter and Mason knew better. He was broken by something older and darker than artillery. The following nights were tense. Every rustle in the mud sent rifles snapping to shoulders. Every shadow drew curses from frightened men. A new patrol was ordered, but no one volunteered. The officers had to threaten punishment to fill the roster. Even then, the men dragged their feet. Mason muttered that sending men out again was madness, but orders were orders. They watched as another group climbed into the fog. That night, the trench held its breath until dawn. When the patrol finally returned, all 5 were accounted for. Yet their faces were pale and drawn. They reported no German activity, but they admitted something else. They had heard footsteps pacing them in the mist, always just out of sight. The rumors grew. They spread through the company like smoke. Men claimed to hear scratching against the trench walls at night as if claws raked the timber. Sentries swore they saw figures crouching beyond the wire before vanishing when challenged. One man swore he woke to find pale hands reaching over the parapet only to withdraw when he shouted. The officers dismissed it all, calling it weakness. Yet their eyes betrayed unease. They too had begun to feel watched. Rations grew thin. Water turned foul. The constant damp ate at the men's strength. They were trapped between 2 enemies, the Germans in front and the wild. Men in the fog, the Germans followed the logic of war. They shelled, they charged, they died. The wild men followed no logic at all. They appeared when they pleased and took who they pleased, leaving no body to bury, no enemy flag to hate, only silence. And Dread Carter noticed the change in Mason. The older soldier who once scoffed at ghost stories now spoke little. He scanned the night with sharp eyes, his rifle always ready. One evening, he admitted quietly that he dreamed of being dragged from the trench by pale figures. He woke each time with his hands clawing at the mud. He confessed he had begun to wonder if the wild men were human. Once perhaps soldiers driven mad, twisted by hunger and isolation. The idea brought no comfort, if anything. It was worse, for if they were once men, then war itself had created them. As autumn deepened, the fog grew heavier, the nights longer, the ground colder. The trench was no longer simply a line of defense. It felt like a cage. The men waited knowing something would happen. They just did not know when, and when the waiting grew too heavy, the mind began to fracture. Carter caught men staring blankly into the dark for hours, lips moving in silent prayer. He heard laughter that had no joy in it. He heard sobs, muffled under blankets. The officers held to discipline, but discipline did little against terror. They forbade talk of wild men. They ordered silence on the subject, yet silence only made the stories more powerful. The men told them in whispers anyway. In corners of the dugouts over dim cigarettes, the wild men had become part of the war now, as real as mud, as real as blood. Then one night the creatures came again, this time not to patrols in the mist, but to the trench itself. Carter had just closed his eyes when the sentry cried out. His voice was high-sharp. A struggle broke out at the wire. Rifles, cracked shouts rang through the trench. Carter leapt up, grabbing his rifle. He rushed to the parapet just in time to see shadows rushing the wire, pale shapes low and fast. The sentry fired point blank. One of the shapes fell thrashing in the mud, its limbs jerking unnaturally. The others surged forward, snarling in guttural tones. Carter fired into the fog. The trench erupted in chaos. Men scrambled. To the line, firing blindly. Mason shouted for calm, but his voice was drowned in gunfire. The creatures did not charge like soldiers. They struck and retreated, darting in and out, dragging at the wire with long arms. Their speed was uncanny. Bullets struck but did not always bring them down. They howled when hit, but they never screamed like men. One soldier was pulled over the parapet before anyone could react. His cries were short, cut off into silence. Another nearly followed, but was dragged back by his comrades, leaving deep gashes across his arms, where pale hands had gripped him. Then, as quickly as it began, the assault ended. The fog swallowed the figures. The night fell still again. The men stood panting, staring into the mist, their rifles shaking. No bodies remained, not even the one shot at point blank. Only churned mud and bloodstains proved the attack had happened. The officers called it a German raid. The men knew better. They had seen the faces, pale, hollow eyes shining in the dark. They had felt the strength of the claws on their comrades' arms. The wild men were real, and they were growing bolder. The trench was no longer safe. Now, even behind their wire, the soldiers knew the monsters could reach them. The denial of the officers cracked that night. They could forbid the word monster, but they could not erase the fear carved into every man's heart. The soldiers of the Great War had another enemy, and it did not wear a uniform. It wore the ruin of humanity twisted into something unrecognizable. The trench had grown quieter since the attack, but not calmer. Silence was no longer a gift to the soldiers. It was a warning. Each man lay awake at night, listening for the smallest sound, a scrape against wood, a rustle in the mud, a breath that was not their own. They did not speak of it openly, but every man knew the truth. The wild men would come again, and when they did, someone would not return. Carter's nerves were frayed. His hands trembled as he wrote in his journal. He described the attack at the wire, the pale figure thrashing in the mud before vanishing into fog. He wrote that the trench itself no longer felt like protection. The wire was useless. The rifles barely slowed the creatures down. He admitted in shaky words that he dreaded sleep for fear of dreaming the same dream where pale hands dragged him into darkness. He snapped the journal shut whenever Mason passed by, ashamed of what he wrote. Yet unable to stop, Mason himself was not the same. The strong, confident soldier who once told Carter ghost stories were foolish, now kept his rifle across his knees even when eating. He slept in short fits, jerking awake at every noise. One night he confessed in a whisper that he believed the wild men had learned something from the soldiers, that they studied the trench like hunters, circling prey. He said this war had stripped men down to their most savage parts, and maybe some men never returned from that place. Maybe they stayed beasts forever. The men kept their watches, but watchfulness did little to protect them. The fog returned each evening, swallowing the broken land until the trench seemed like an island floating in a sea of gray. One such night, Private Thompson was posted near the far end. He was young and nervous, his rifle clutched tight. The others heard him humming softly to steady himself. Then, without warning, his humming stopped. A muffled cry rang out, followed by frantic shouts. The men rushed toward him, only to find his rifle lying on the parapet. Still warm from his hands, Thompson was gone. The trench exploded in chaos. Mason led a group scrambling over the duckboard, searching the wire. Carter among them. The fog pressed thick against their faces. They heard Thompson's voice somewhere out, there in the mist, crying for help. Then his voice broke into screams. Ragged, desperate pleas that chilled the marrow of every man listening. The screams rose high, then choked off abruptly, leaving only silence. The patrol fired blindly into the fog, their shots echoing across the dead ground. But no reply came, not from Thompson, not from anything. The soldiers returned, shaken. They had lost a man, not in battle, but to something unseen, something that had taken him alive. The officers barked orders, shouted for calm, declared that Thompson had deserted. That lie did not last a single hour. Every man in the trench had heard the screams. They knew he had not run away. He had been dragged away. That night no one slept. The trench felt haunted. Every rustle of cloth, every drip of water made men jerk upright with rifles ready. Some whispered prayers, others stared into the fog unmoving. Carter sat against the wall, his eyes burning from lack of rest. He could still hear Thompson's voice in his head, a memory that would not fade. He wondered if the wild men had killed him quickly, or if he was still alive somewhere in the wasteland. Pray for things no human should face. Morning brought little comfort. The fog lifted, showing only broken ground and silence. No sign of Thompson remained, not a shred of cloth, not a boot print. The earth had swallowed him whole, like it had swallowed so many before. The men worked their duties in silence, but their fear grew heavier. They had always feared death. In battle, but this was worse. Death was certain. It was human. What had taken Thompson was not. As days passed, the wild men seemed bolder. Shadows lingered longer near the wire. Shapes darted between craters in daylight, just out of rifle range. The men began to hear faint noises during the day, guttural calls that carried across the mud. Mason swore once that he saw a pale figure crouched in a distant crater watching them. It vanished the moment he blinked, but the image remained branded in his mind. The officers clung to discipline. They told the men to stay focused on the enemy across the line. They forbade talk of monsters. They blamed nerves and fatigue. But the soldiers no longer cared about orders. They had their own truth whispered. In the dugouts in the dark, they spoke of Thompson. They swore they would never forget the sound of him being carried away. They knew the wild men were not myths. They were hunters, and the soldiers were their prey. One evening, as the light faded, Carter and Mason shared a cigarette. Mason spoke quietly, saying he feared the creatures were learning, growing braver. That soon, they would not stop at patrols or lone sentries. They would come for the trench in full. Carter asked what they wanted. Mason's face was grim. Maybe food, maybe madness, maybe just the thrill of hunting. But whatever their reason, he said they would not stop until they had taken every man. Carter slept little that night. His dreams blurred with waking visions. He saw pale faces. Staring through the fog, he heard Thompson's screams rising again and again. Each time he reached for his rifle, but the rifle was gone. The screams always ended the same, with silence, thick and final. He woke with sweat cold on his neck. His journal lay open beside him, the pencil broken where his hand had pressed too hard. He closed it quickly and tried not to think of what waited outside the wire. The wild men had shown the soldiers something worse than death. They had shown them what it meant to be taken alive, and that knowledge was a heavier burden than the war itself. The trench was tense, as if the air itself carried warning. The men no longer spoke of if the wild men would return. They spoke only of when Carter felt it in his chest, like a clock counting down. Mason felt it too. He muttered that the night would be bad. He was right. The fog came earlier than usual, rolling across no man's land long before dusk. It was heavier than before, sinking low into the shell craters and spilling over the trench parapets. The men readied their rifles, but each knew it would not matter. They had fired before, and the creatures had only melted back into the mist unscathed. Their weapons offered comfort, but not hope. Carter sat with Mason near the fire step, listening to the silence. Their breaths came shallow, their hands restless. The trench seemed alive with shadows. The officers ordered strict watch, but the men were already watching more keenly than orders could enforce. Every ear strained for the faintest sound. It began with a low whistle, carrying faintly over the mud. It was not the sound of any bird nor the call of a soldier. It was something guttural, a drawn-out note that froze the blood. A reply echoed from another crater, then another, until the trench seemed surrounded by unseen voices. Mason gripped his rifle tight. Carter's heart pounded in his ears. The wild men were calling to one another. Suddenly movement erupted near the wire. A pale figure darted forward on all fours, unnaturally fast. It crashed against the wire, thrashing with strength that rattled the posts. The soldiers opened fire. Bullets cracked through the fog. The figure shrieked a sound more beast than man and fell back into the mist. Silence followed, only for another shape to lunge from the opposite flank. Then, another from the rear. The trench was under attack. Chaos tore through the line. Soldiers fired wildly into the fog, bayonets fixed, men shouting orders no one could hear. Carter felt himself swept into motion. His rifle barked flame again and again, but he could not tell if he struck anything. Shapes moved too quickly, vanishing the instant they were seen. Mason beside him shouted to hold steady, but his voice was drowned by screams from further down the trench. The creatures had broken through. Two men vanished in a blur, yanked over the parapet by pale hands. Their cries rose, then faded into the fog. Carter stumbled toward the sound, tripping over mud and boards. He saw a soldier dragged into a crater, thrashing as the fog swallowed him. Carter raised his rifle but froze. The creature bent over. The man had a face twisted between human and animal. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the muzzle flash. Its jaw unhinged wider than any man's before sinking into the screaming throat. Carter fired, but the shape was gone, leaving only silence and blood-soaked earth. Back in the trench, Mason fought hand to hand. One of the wild men had leapt down into the fire step, knocking a soldier flat. Mason drove his bayonet through its side. The creature shrieked and convulsed, its pale skin slick with blood. Yet it did not fall. It clawed at Mason's face, forcing him back. Carter rushed in, swinging the butt of his rifle with all his strength. The blow cracked bone. The creature collapsed, limp. Mason gasped for air, staring at the body on the ground. It twitched once, then went still. The men gathered around, staring wide-eyed. The corpse looked human, too human beneath the mud and blood. Its limbs were thin but strong, its face distorted, but recognizably a man. Carter whispered that it must have once been a soldier, perhaps lost years ago. Mason shook his head. He said no soldier could become that. The wild men were something else entirely. The men did not have time to argue. A new cry rose louder than before, a chorus of howls rolling across the battlefield. The creatures were retreating, dragging bodies with them into the fog. The men fired wildly, desperate to stop them, but the mist closed around the shadows, swallowing all trace of man or monster. Carter collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. The trench stank of smoke, sweat, and blood. When dawn broke, the fog lifted, revealing the damage. 3 men gone, taken alive. 2 more dead in the trench. The wire was torn as if by claws. The ground stained dark. Mason sat silent, staring at the corpse they had killed. It had stiffened overnight, its features more visible now. Its uniform scraps suggested it had once been German, maybe even French. No one could say how long ago it had fallen into the mud, or what had changed it. Carter could not look at its face without feeling his stomach twist. He turned away, but the image burned in his mind. The officers ordered the body buried quickly. They gave no explanation, and told the men to keep quiet. Carter knew silence would not erase what they had seen. The wild men were real. They were men once, and now they were something else. Soldiers twisted into hunters by the darkness of no man's land. The men buried the corpse, but they could not bury the truth. That night the trench lay restless. No one spoke, but everyone thought the same thought. The creatures would come again, and next time there would be more of them. Carter closed his eyes, trying to sleep, but the howls from the night before echoed in his head. He knew they were not safe, not in the trench, not anywhere between the lines. The wild men were watching, waiting, and learning. The war had created monsters, and now those monsters were hungry. The trench had grown heavy with dread after the raid. The men spoke less each day, their eyes hollow and their movements mechanical. They worked their duties as if by instinct, repairing wire cleaning rifles, stacking sandbags, but their minds were far away. Mason kept staring at the place where the creature had fallen. His silence louder than words, Carter wrote in his journal, but the pages were less coherent. Each night filled with broken sentences, half-finished thoughts, and sketches of pale faces. The officers tried to restore order, but their voices carried little weight. The soldiers no longer feared bullets the way they feared the fog. They knew now that the wild men were not just shadows. They were real, and they were close. Every night carried the chance of another raid. Every silence was heavy with waiting. One morning, as dawn bled through the mist, Carter noticed something strange on the wire. A scrap of cloth fluttered, caught on the twisted metal. It was not British uniform, but German gray, torn and darkened with old blood. Mason saw it too. He muttered that the creatures did not care about sides. The thought chilled Carter more than any rifle fire. The wild men did not fight for empire or cause. They hunted whoever they found. That afternoon, the strange truth became clearer. The Germans across the way had begun firing fewer shots. The sporadic bursts of gunfire that usually echoed through the day had gone quiet. In their place, strange signals rose across the no-man's, land whistles and shouts that were not aimed at the British, but at the fog. The enemy was nervous, frightened. The same dread sat in their lines. The revelation came at night. A flare arced into the sky, illuminating the battlefield in harsh white light. In its glow, Carter saw movement, not of soldiers, but of shapes slinking through the craters. One of the wild men crouched close, its pale skin glaring in the sudden brightness. It darted back into shadow, and the flare fizzled out. Shots rang out from both sides, not at each other, but at the creatures. The battlefield had turned against both armies at once. The next morning, Mason pulled Carter aside. He had been watching the Germans through a periscope. He swore he saw them signaling waving helmets, on sticks not as a trick, but as a plea. Carter did not believe it at first, but soon he saw it too. A crude attempt at communication, not with arrogance, but with fear. It was unthinkable, the idea that enemies would seek contact without bullets yet. The sight could not be ignored. By evening, the decision was made. Small groups crept forward cautiously. Hands raised rifles, slung British and German, both meeting in the dead center of no man's land. Carter went with Mason, his heart pounding. Every step across that broken earth felt like madness. They expected shots to ring out at any second, but none came. Instead, a handful of German soldiers emerged from their own fog, eyes wide, hands shaking. The two groups stood staring at one another like ghosts in a graveyard. One German spoke broken English, his voice raw. He pointed toward the craters, then tapped his chest, repeating the word, Jaeger Hunter. The word carried weight even in another tongue. They feared the same creatures Carter felt, it like a stone dropped in his stomach. These monsters had haunted both sides. The meeting was brief. A few words exchanged, hand gestures, rough drawings in the dirt. They all agreed on one truth. The wild men came for them all. No uniform protected them. The fog was their enemy, not each other. Before dawn, they retreated to their trenches, each side uneasy, but with an unspoken understanding. Back in the dugout, Carter could not sleep. His mind spun around the sight of German faces drawn with the same fear his own men carried. The war had ground on for years, turning men into enemies. Yet now it revealed something worse than bullets. He wondered if the wild men had once stood as soldiers on either side, if they too had once believed in flags and commands before they became hunters. In the dark, Mason lay beside him, staring at the low roof of the dugout. He finally spoke after hours of silence. He said perhaps the war had made the wild men, that the mud and fear and endless killing had carved something out of the souls of broken men until only beasts remained. Carter did not answer. He could not. He only closed his eyes tighter against the thought. The next days were tense but different. Shots were fired rarely, and when they were, it was not at men. The Germans and British watched the same fog, and sometimes Carter thought he saw their eyes in the distance, through binoculars staring back, not with hatred, but with grim recognition. Mason said it would not last. Command would never allow it. The war would demand they fight again, but for now, a fragile thread of survival tied them together. That night, the fog rolled in again, thick and merciless. The men gripped their rifles, waiting. Carter whispered a prayer, not for victory, not even for survival, but that if the wild men came, they would not take him alive. In the distance, across the fog, faint gunfire rattled, then screams rose, carried across the barren ground. German screams torn with the same terror the British had known. The men in Carter's trench froze, listening. Mason muttered that their fragile truce had already been tested. The creatures did not care who screamed. They only cared that someone did. The war had paused for a heartbeat, but the nightmare in no man's land never rested. The fragile truce was nothing more than desperation against a darkness too large for either side to hold back. The wild men were not soldiers. They were the war itself, stripped of flags and reason, and they would not be stopped. The trench waited in silence, every man certain the fragile truce would shatter, but it was not rifles that broke the night. It was the howls. They began low drifting through the fog, like echoes of something half human, half beast. At first, Carter thought it was the wind. Then the cries grew louder, overlapping until the whole battlefield trembled with sound. It was not one voice. It was many. Mason gripped his rifle so tight his knuckles turned pale. He whispered that they were gathering Carter, felt his chest tighten. The wild men had always struck in small numbers, dragging a sentry or a lone patrol. But now the air carried a different weight. This was not a hunt. This was an assault. The fog thickened until even the man beside you was only a shadow. Shapes flickered at the wire. First one, then three, then more. Pale limbs stretched and clawed as bodies hurled themselves at the defenses. The soldiers opened fire. The trench lit up with muzzle flashes. The noise-deafening bullets ripped into the fog. Some figures fell, but many more surged forward. Their shrieks cut through the roar of rifles. Carter fired blindly, working the bolt with frantic speed. He saw a face for an instant, a mouth stretched too wide, eyes glowing faintly. Then, it was gone, replaced by another shape leaping onto the wire. The creature clawed at the posts with strength that bent steel. Mason shoved his bayonet through its throat, but another followed, smashing into the parapet. Men screamed as they fought. Hand to hand, bayonets against claws, fists against teeth. The trench was breaking from across no man's land. New gunfire erupted, German rifles cracking into the same fog. Carter realized the enemy was fighting the same wave. The howls answered from every side. The wild men had come for both armies together. The battlefield was no longer lines against lines. It was a pit with monsters circling. All one of the creatures dropped into the trench beside Carter, knocking him hard against the wall. Its weight crushed him, pale skin slick with mud. Its breath reeked of rot. Carter fought wildly, driving his bayonet upward. The blade sank deep, but the creature only shrieked, thrashing against him. Mason rushed in, smashing the butt of his rifle down, again and again, until the skull split open. The body twitched and went still. Carter gasped for air, his chest burning. Mason pulled him to his feet, shouting that the line was failing. The trench filled with screams. A soldier was dragged up and over, the parapet, his cries fading as he vanished into fog. Another fired point blank into a pale chest, only to be struck down by claws. Carter stumbled past bodies, half human, half beast. He could no longer tell if some of them had once been soldiers. The faces were too twisted, but fragments of uniforms clung to their skin like ghosts of another life. A flare burst overhead, casting the battlefield in harsh light. For a moment, the fog burned white, and Carter saw them. 100 shapes swarming between, the lines crawling from craters, leaping from shattered earth. They moved like a tide, unstoppable. He saw Germans fighting side by side with British, their rifles turned outward toward the fog. He saw men from both armies dragged screaming into the mass. He saw the wild men tearing through wire with bare hands, their bodies blotched with scars and mud. Carter knew then they could not hold the line. Mason shoved him toward the rear, shouting to fall back. They stumbled through chaos, smoke, dirt, screams all around. A blast shook the trench as grenades were hurled into the advancing tide. The explosions ripped craters into the horde, but more poured in. Carter and Mason reached a dugout where a handful of men fought to regroup their officer, barked orders, his voice breaking. They were to hold the dugout at all costs. Carter looked at Mason and saw the truth in his eyes. They would not hold anything. The wild men crashed against the dugout entrance. Bodies writhed in the doorway, claws raking. As bayonets thrust back, Carter fought shoulder to shoulder with Mason, each movement desperate sweat and blood blinding him. A creature lunged its jaws, clamping down on a soldier's neck, dragging him into the dark. Another burst through the timber. Forcing its way inside, Mason drove his rifle forward. Carter swung his shovel, cracking bone. The creature collapsed, but others pressed close. Hours blurred into moments. The screams never ended. The fog pressed heavier until Carter thought it was suffocating him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the assault began to ebb. The howls receded, growing fainter. The shapes pulled back, dragging bodies with them, leaving only silence and ruin. Dawn broke cold and gray. The trench was a graveyard. Dozens of men lay dead. More had been taken. The wire was gone. The earth torn and clawed. Carter sat in the mud, unable to move. His rifle lay beside him, but his hands shook too badly to lift it. Mason slumped against the wall, his face streaked with blood. Not all his own. They had survived, but barely. Across no man's land, the Germans had suffered the same fate. Their trenches burned, smoke rising into the sky. The fragile truce had not saved them. It had only proven what both sides feared. The wild men were not legend. They were legion, and they had shown their full strength as the sun rose pale and weak. Carter felt a hollow truth settle in his chest. The war between men no longer mattered. The greater war had already begun. The night of howls was only the beginning. Morning settled over the broken trench like a shroud. The battlefield smelled of blood, cordite, and rot. Carter sat in the mud, staring at the bodies piled along the fire step. He tried not to count them, but his eyes betrayed him. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at 10. His mind refused to go further. Mason sat nearby, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had not spoken since the night of howls. He only stared at the wire. What was left of it, twisted and torn as if a storm had ripped through the survivors, moved like ghosts. Their eyes were sunken, their uniforms ragged. They spoke in low voices, or not at all. No one dared step beyond the parapet. The fog had thinned with daylight, but the memory of what lay in it lingered. Every man expected the howls to return at any moment. Carter cleaned his rifle, though he knew it was useless. His hands moved by habit, not hope. When word came from command, it arrived as if from another world. A runner staggered into the trench carrying orders on crumpled paper. His face was blank when he saw the devastation. He handed the message to the officer and left without speaking. The officer read aloud, his voice brittle. They were to repair the wire, hold the line, and prepare for renewed German attack. No mention of what had happened. No acknowledgement of the creatures that had swarmed through the night. The official line was silence. The men muttered in disbelief. Some cursed, others laughed bitterly. Mason finally spoke, his voice rough. They know they must, know, but they will not speak it. Carter felt the weight of his words. The officers could bury reports. They could call it nerves, madness, or exhaustion. But they could not bury the screams that still echoed in every man's ears. The silence from command was worse than denial. It was betrayal. That night no one slept. The trench was too quiet. Every creak of timber, every drip of water made men flinch. Carter clutched his journal but could not bring himself to write. The words would not come, he feared. That putting the truth to paper would make it heavier, more permanent. Mason sat with him, whispering that the wild men were not finished, that the night of howls was only a test. Carter believed him at dawn. Carter caught sight of movement across no man's land. A group of Germans emerged cautiously from their own broken line. They carried no rifles, only stretchers bearing bodies. Carter felt a chill. Some were dead soldiers wrapped in blankets. Others were not human, at least not any more pale. Limbs twisted beneath the coverings, distorted faces glimpsed only briefly before they were hidden. The Germans were burying their own horrors. Carter wondered if they too had been ordered into silence. The day passed in uneasy work. The men repaired wire, though their hands shook. They filled sandbags, though they knew it would not hold. Mason muttered that the trench was no longer a defense, only a cage. Carter felt the truth of it. The fog was waiting, watching. He swore he saw shapes moving at the edge of vision. Pale figures crouched in craters, but when he blinked, they were gone. As night fell, the fear grew heavier. Carter tried to steady himself by writing. His journal filled with jagged lines, his words blurred with shaking hands. He wrote that the wild men were not monsters from nowhere, but men twisted by war. He described their faces half familiar, half alien. He wrote of Thompson's screams, the night of howls, the silence from command. He stopped only when the pencil broke, snapping. Between his fingers, Mason told him to rest, but Carter only stared at the darkness. That night, no raid came. The trench remained quiet, too quiet. Men sat awake in silence, afraid of sleep. Carter felt dread coiling tighter with every passing hour. It was as if the creatures were letting them breathe, only to remind them that breath could be taken at any time. Mason whispered in the dark that the wild men were learning, that they were waiting for something. Carter did not ask what he already feared. The answer: when morning came, the fog had thinned, revealing a landscape of ruin, craters torn deeper. Wire-shredded bodies half buried in mud. The battlefield looked less like ground and more like a graveyard. Carter wondered how many of the wild men hid beneath the earth, waiting to rise again. He thought of the buried corpse the officers had silenced. He thought of what it might become. Command sent more orders: repair, hold, advance. Carter folded the paper in his hands and laughed without humor. Advance into what? Into the fog, into the waiting claws. The officers read the orders with stiff faces, but their eyes betrayed them. They were just as afraid as the men. They obeyed silence because silence was easier than truth. Carter and Mason sat, side by side as night fell. The fog rolled in again, slow, heavy. Carter whispered that maybe the Germans had it right. Maybe the only truce left was with death. Mason said nothing. He only loaded his rifle one more time. The silence from command was louder than the howls had ever been, and it told the men one simple truth: they were alone. The final night came without warning. It was no darker than the others, no colder, no heavier with fog. Yet every man in the trench felt it deep in his bones. Carter knew it the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Mason knew it too. He looked at Carter and gave a small nod as if to say they both understood. This would be the end. The trench was quiet except for the rasp of breathing and the faint click of rifles being loaded. The men no longer spoke of tomorrow. There was no tomorrow not. Here, they sat on the fire step, staring into the mist, their eyes red from exhaustion, their hands steady from resignation. The silence stretched until it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then the howls began. They rose together, not from one place, but from all directions. A wall of sound rolling across the dead land. Carter's heart hammered, but his hand stayed steady. He raised his rifle. Mason beside him doing the same. The creatures came like a tide, pale shapes pouring from the fog, dozens, scores, maybe more. Their bodies writhed over the wire, clawed through sandbags, leapt into the trench itself. The wild men had come to finish what they started. The trench erupted in chaos. Men fired point blank into faces, twisted and slick with mud. Bullets tore flesh, but the creatures did not fall fast enough. They clawed and bit, dragging soldiers screaming into the mist. Carter fired again and again until the rifle clicked empty. He drove his bayonet forward, piercing pale flesh, then ripped it free. Mason swung his rifle like a club, cracking skulls as blood sprayed the timber walls. The trench became a slaughterhouse. Carter stumbled over bodies, friends, and beasts alike. He slipped in blood, but forced himself up. A creature lunged, jaws snapping. He shoved the bayonet upward, feeling bone crack. The scream that followed was high and shrill, inhuman, yet horribly human. The weight collapsed on him. He shoved it off, gasping for air. Mason pulled him to his feet, shouting above. "The din we hold here, Carter. We hold or we die." Carter shouted back, "We die either way." The line shattered in places. Men were dragged out one by one. Their screams rose and fell, quickly swallowed by the fog. The officers tried to rally them, but the orders dissolved into panic. The trench no longer belonged to men. It belonged to the wild Carter, and Mason fought side by side near the dugout. The creatures pressed harder each moment. The air filled with howls, shrieks, gunfire, and the desperate cries of dying men. Mason slammed his rifle into one face, then another. His eyes wild, his teeth clenched. Carter swung his shovel, cracking skulls, splitting jaws. He no longer thought of survival, only of taking as many down as he could before he was dragged away. The fog closed tighter. The trench narrowed to a world of mud and blood. Carter lost count of how many he struck, how many he killed, if they could even be killed. Mason shouted his name, pulling him back from the parapet, where claws had nearly grabbed him. They retreated step by step into the dugout, a handful of survivors huddled there. Carter saw the fear in their eyes, the acceptance. They all knew the same truth. No reinforcements were coming. Command would never acknowledge them. They were alone. The creatures crashed into the dugout entrance, claws tearing timbers apart. The survivors fired in a frenzy. Mason roared defiance. Carter screamed with him. The doorway filled with pale bodies thrashing and shrieking. Bullets tore them back, but more surged forward. Carter drove his bayonet again and again, until the blade bent. Mason fought until his rifle broke, then seized a shovel, swinging wild. The dugout shook as if the earth itself would collapse. One by one, the survivors fell, pulled screaming into the fog. Carter watched them vanish until only he and Mason remained. Mason, bloodied and staggering, looked at Carter with a grim smile. He said quietly, "If they take me, don't let me live like them." Carter nodded, though his throat closed tight. Mason charged into the doorway, slamming into the massive creatures. Carter screamed and followed, the two of them side by side one last time. The final moments blurred in blood and chaos. Carter felt claws tear his uniform teeth, scrape his skin. He swung until his arms failed, until his vision swam. Mason roared until his voice broke. The creatures closed around them, endless pale faces, endless shrieks. The fog swallowed the dugout, the trench, the world itself. And then silence when dawn came. The trench was empty. No bodies remained, no trace of the men or the wild. Only broken timbers, torn wire, and blood dark in the mud. The battlefield stood quiet under the pale morning sky. Soldiers on distant lines whispered of a trench lost. Overnight, swallowed by the fog, command denied it. They said the men had deserted. They said the trench had never fallen. But in the mist that lingered over no man's land, some swore they heard faint cries. Cries that sounded almost human. Almost the you. War raged on, flags rose and fell. Orders passed down. Battles claimed thousands. Yet between the trenches the wild men still prowled. Born of mud, death, and silence. They hunted both sides without mercy. And in the cold hours before dawn, their howls reminded the living of a truth darker than war itself. Some monsters wear uniforms. Some are made by mud and fear. Some are waiting in the fog.